Robert came home for the summer. One of the first things he wanted to do was to visit the raccoon family. Roxy will eat you alive, I warned. She doesn't look vicious to me, he said. I'd like to see what happens. Well, be prepared to defend yourself. I don't want to go in there and rescue you. Robert opened the cage and stepped inside. Roxy looked up, but she did not growl or charge towards this intruder. Robert sat down on the box that he had used so often as a chair. Roxy calmly waddled over and climbed up on his lap. She allowed Robert to fondle her as if nothing was different from the way it had always been. Four youngsters who were used to being petted gathered around Robert, tugging at his trouser cuffs, trying to climb up to join their mother. What a pretty sight! I wish I had taken a picture. From that time, Roxy's bad temper simply disappeared. I had no more trouble with her at all. We were friends again. Ever since the 1st of July, I had been working on a plan to build a new home for the raccoon family. I knew that I should not keep 5 raccoons in a pen large enough for only one. Our daughter and her husband were visiting for a few weeks. Her husband and Robert and I began building a new home right next to the old one. It was to be a grand home, built of concrete. The house would have 2 stories. In the yard, we made 3 ponds, lined with concrete. We planned to pave the whole yard with concrete, with proper drainage, and there would be a big tree stump for the animals to climb. Unexpected delays, however, kept me from finishing the job. Now that it was October, I would really have to hurry to get everything ready before freezing weather closed down the project. Of course, I could turn all 5 of the pets loose. I had thought about doing that, but I wanted to wait until they had tried out their new home. Also, I hoped to get some good pictures of them together before the family separated. Besides, I told myself, it seemed unfair to keep them cooped up all summer and then kick them out just before winter. Living in the new home would be almost like being free. There would be a lot of room to run, with no wire overhead between them and the sky and the trees. I had seen raccoons climb up a chicken wire fence, so I had to fix something to keep my pets from climbing over the wire wall. I fastened strips of sheet metal, about 18 inches wide, round the top of the wall. That would make it impossible for them to get a hold of the wire. Finally, just a few days before the weather turned cold, everything was ready. The ponds had water in them. The house had clean straw on the floors. I just knew my pets would be happy with their new home. I had built the new yard right against the back of the old cottage. All I had to do to let my pets into their palace was to open the old back door. It took Roxy only a few minutes to notice that the door was open. At once, she led her family into what she probably thought was freedom, exploring every niche and crevice, every inch of the wire wall, the ponds, and the inside and outside of the bigger house. Kept Roxy and the 4 daughters busy for about an hour. Then I saw Roxy look up. She saw the treetops and the blue sky, with no wire roof in the way. She began looking along the metal barrier around the upper edge of the wire wall. I knew that she was already planning some way of escape. Just to have the little lady look that way made me feel disappointed. I had gone to a lot of trouble and expense making this fine new home for her, and she seemed not the least thankful for my efforts. With a creepy feeling, I began to doubt that this new wall would hold her. I decided that if she managed to escape again, I would let her stay free. Cats, always want to explore anything new or different around their home. They always look for extra food. One day, one of our cats must have noticed that there was some uneaten food inside that wire fence. Climbed up one of the posts at the corner of the yard and jumped down inside, probably intending to head straight for the food dish. Three of the raccoons noticed the stranger in their palace grounds, and they hurried over to find out what was happening. As the three nosy coons waddled toward him, the cat froze in his tracks. He arched his back and stuck his tail up in the air, hissing as cats do. But the raccoons kept coming. They sniffed the cat all over, and they must have decided that he was harmless, and they turned away. As soon as the raccoons turned, the cat bolted for the fence, not bothering to find a corner post. He ran up the wall. I wondered what he would do when he reached the metal band at the top. Well, I had failed to consider one weakness in my construction design. I had not put a pipe or talc cable along the top to keep the wire from sagging between posts. When the cat reached the metal band, his weight caused the top of the wire to tilt outward just a little bit. The cat hunched up, with his hind feet under his body. Then he stretched out his front legs, straightened out his back legs, and slid his body across the smooth metal. As soon as his front feet reached the top, the cat pulled himself up and jumped down outside. Roxy had seen the whole show. I knew she would do anything a cat could do, only do it better. The next morning, Roxy was high in the big cottonwood tree. The four youngsters were still in their new home. I knew better than to try bringing Roxy down. I also knew Robert would be home for the holidays that night. Roxy loved Robert more than anyone else. Perhaps he could help. Sure enough, the next morning Roxy was still up in the tree. Robert went out and called to her. She backed down the tree and climbed to his shoulder. Robert carried his favorite pets back to her new home to rejoin her family. 2 days later, Roxy led two of her daughters over the fence and up the tree. Then the rather mild weather took a sudden turn for the worse. That night, a frigid wind swept in from the Arctic. The temperature fell to 20 degrees below zero. For 4 days, Roxy and her two daughters stayed high in that leafless tree, huddled against the trunk, without food or water. Hundreds of cattle froze to death in eastern Montana during that storm. About 6 o'clock on the fifth morning, the Arctic blast having erased, I went out in the gray pre-dawn to feed the cattle. I found Roxy sitting on the top of a 12-foot gate post, where she had allowed Kulak to tree her. I knew she was not really afraid of the big dog. I think she was trying to hold his attention while her two timid daughters came down from the tree. Later in the day, all three of them disappeared, leaving the two sisters snug inside their new home. In the spring, when we were sure that the cold winter had ended, we released these two also. Before the winter was over, however, we had a real scare. I found a dead raccoon near the old cottage. Both Luis and I thought it was Roxy, but when I examined the body closely, I could identify it as one of the daughters she had taken with her. The youngster had accidentally touched the high voltage wires above the transformer in our yard. I wondered if Roxy had seen the tragedy. Would she be frightened away, never to return?